welcome. First of all, I'll do a little bit of housekeeping. If you need the toilet, it's straight across here. There's a series of toilets there. We're not expecting any fire alarms, but should you hear the fire alarm, just come back out the same way that you came in, just around the corner here. So, welcome. This is our third Service Futures Lab public event this year. We are trying to do them on a regular basis, more or less once a month. And should you want to be kept up to date about future events, this is the QR code to sign up for the newsletter. It's also on the door, so you can also scan it on your way out. So I'm Silvia Grimaldi. I'm a reader in Service Design and Collaborative Futures here at LCC. And I'm also the co-director of the Service Futures Lab, together with Lara Salinas, who couldn't make it today. She's ill. And I would like to introduce our amazing guests today. So I'm going to introduce them in the order in which they will come on. So Jenny Winfield, who's the head of research at Chen. And she will be talking about Chen's trauma-informed design principles and how to research with those. Then we have Hannah Jump. She's senior service designer at the Courts and Tribunal Service, and she will be talking about how she's designed for social justice in both internal and external facing ways at the Court and Tribunal Service. Then we have Professor Alison Prendeville from LCC. She's professor of service design, and she will be talking about tools that she developed to acknowledge multiple knowledges while working on the field on antimicrobial resistance in India. Correct? Yep. More or less. Then we have Ivor Williams, who's lead product designer at Acrux, but actually he'll be talking about a project that he did in a previous role. And he will be talking about designing hospices for children with a focus on play and connection with nature. And then we have Mega Wadawan, who is design lead at TPX Impact. And she will be talking about how design shapes the social and how the social shapes design through both service patterns and citizen assemblies. And finally, we have Becca Dove. She is the head of family early help for the London Borough of Camden. And we collaborated in the past on an amazing project, which she will be talking about today. And what is really interesting is that she's not a designer. She is talking from the point of view of a public servant and what impact design had on the organization after we finished the project. So I wanted to thank you, all of the panel, for being here and for participating in this. And being an academic, I obviously have a really strong interest in the teaching aspect of this. So, how can we train designers who arrive at the end of a course that is all designed around social justice, right? And they finish, and often they have a crisis of, I'm going to go work in, a multinational, I'm going to go work in a consultancy, I'm going to go work, and how am I going to continue this type of work in those types of roles? And there's quite a lot of kind of fear of disillusionment going on at the end of the course, etc. And what I wanted to do was kind of start exploring how you can practice and research in a way that you're doing kind of small steps every day in a particular direction, and it doesn't have to be all or nothing, You can always kind of make change in gradual ways. And also, my interest is from the point of view that I am, white European woman from kind of a middle-class-ish background, educated in an institution, and then from my positionality, how do I conduct research and other activities with different communities in a way that is respectful and, gives agency where it needs to be given, etc. And following that, the brief that I gave the speakers was really about, we know that the ways in which we design are not necessarily always perfect. They work within a system that has inequalities built in. And so I asked them to explore in what ways have they challenged the current ways in which design is done, and in what ways have they kind of tried to explore different practices, and what impact has that had. So I will just introduce you very briefly to a few things that we've done over the years. As a Service Futures Lab, we work very closely with the Masters in Service Design here at London College of Communication, as well as a bunch of other courses across the university, and partners that go from government, local government, as well as third sector, as well as businesses, etc. These are some of the projects that we've done in the past few years that have something to do with social justice, and I've pulled this from things that I've done. We wrote a paper recently that I have to plug at everything that I do, which is around teaching service design. And what we talk about here is teaching through live projects, and in what ways can we keep kind of that relationship between having students work on projects that are meaningful within communities, etc., and that provide social value in the real world and could be applied and all of that, while also respecting those communities that we work with, while also respecting kind of us as researchers and the amount of work that is necessary to put together these sorts of collaborations. And this is another project that is going to be published very, very soon, I promise, but there's a few people here that were co-designers on this. And it's a framework for equality, diversity, and inclusion and inclusive design within primarily product and digital product. So keep your eyes open. This will be kind of out in the public realm soon. So without further ado, I will pass you on to Jenny.
See if I can do this. Can we hear me? Okay, sweet. And clickers, let's get to grips with the tech. Oh, here we go. So hi everyone, my name is Jenny. I am head of research at CHEN. And I'd like to start with a quote from a trauma practitioner that I respect a lot called Hala Corey. And she says, "Social injustice is traumatizing. This needs to be named in trauma work. When this doesn't happen, individuals can be blamed for behavior, thoughts, and feelings that are natural responses to an overwhelming or untenable situation. There can be a subtle or not so subtle implication that it's their weakness or their lack of resilience that got them where they are, not a larger system that sees them as disposable or doesn't even see them at all." So just in terms of linking the topic of social injustice to the topic that I work on at CHEN. So CHEN is a global non-profit that supports survivors of gender-based violence. And today I'm going to talk about trauma-informed design, which is something that we employ in everything that we do. So CHEN, getting the awkward thing out of the way first, is pronounced Chen. A lot of people say chain. But it's a word that means peace of mind in Urdu. Our founder, Hira Hussain, is from Pakistan. We believe that every survivor deserves solace, and we won't stop until that's accomplished. So no big deal. So yeah, we were set up just over 10 years ago. We provide online free resources to survivors of gender-based violence all over the world in 14 different languages. And when I say gender-based violence, I mean things like domestic violence, intimate partner violence, sexual assault or abuse, and increasingly technology-facilitated abuse as well. Every resource that we create, everything that we do has survivor lived experience at its core. So we're a small but mighty team of 10 or 12 people supported by tons and tons of volunteers globally. And so far, our resources have reached over 500,000 people around the world, which is awesome. And when you see quotes like this, and when you hear things like this from users, it makes it all feel worthwhile. So this is somebody that I spoke to recently about one of our products. And she said, "This whole thing makes my heart warm up. It's like chicken soup for my survivor soul. It felt like the mothership calling and the service that I wish I had 15 years ago." So what do? We use the power of technology to help survivors of gender-based violence, no matter where they live, what culture they belong to, what language they speak. So as I said, 14 languages and counting. And we do this in a couple of different ways. So information and education is really important to us. So empowering survivors with information that they need. essentially like understanding what abuse is, how to spot it, how to understand whether it's happened to you. Working with survivors to design tools and resources which help them but also systematically change patriarchal structures that enable abuse. And then we also do a lot of advocating work as well, so trauma-informed approaches to the design of technology products so that we can do more to prevent harm. And this is our landing page, so if you want to go and check us out, it's chen.co. So this is a deliberate design decision that we made to make our resources feel warm, welcoming, like a place of solace, so that they would live up to our name. This is over 10 years ago, and lots of resources for survivors of things like domestic abuse and assault were text-heavy PDFs with pictures of crying women and children, very depressing, very bleak, not at all a hopeful place where you might feel welcomed and find some community too. One of our core beliefs is that where there's trauma, there's room for healing, but that route to healing will look different for everybody. So we make sure that throughout all of our resources and the way that we speak about trauma, we talk about it in a pluralistic way. We don't crunch people into flattened stories. We don't assume everybody has the same needs. Trauma is so pervasive around the world that, of course, our experiences of it and our responses to it are not all going to look the same. And when we think about design at Chen, we think about it in a way that's both transformational, so it can transform people's lives if they get access to services that are designed in a really great way, and transportive, so it can give people ideas of their future, ideas of a hopeful, different way of living that can help them kind of move through their trauma and heal. But we also recognize that design can be an exclusionary force. It can be an exclusionary thing, so we do everything that we can to try and make it feel welcoming and inclusive. And when we think about design, we think about service design, product design, content design, organizational design. All of the principles that we use feed into all of those things. And as a researcher, I'm also thinking about the way I design my research. So how am I going to design the study that I'm about to do? How will I engage with participants that are survivors, and so on? And the trauma-informed design principles that we use are these 8. They might look a little bit different from other ones that you may have seen, but that's because we have been inspired by all of the work that's been going on in trauma, for the past 30 plus years, by clinical practitioners and mainly social workers, actually. And we've translated and kind of thought through and built on those with the context of gender-based violence in mind. And so the 8 principles I'm just going to talk through briefly. And these are the things that we have found are really missing for people when they've experienced the trauma of gender-based violence. So people who have experienced this trauma have often been made to feel very unsafe, psychologically, physically. They have often lost agency, so the kinds of trauma and coercive control and abuse they've experienced has led to a lack of feeling of agency. We know that trauma does not get experienced by everybody in a distributed way throughout society. There are marginalised groups who are much more at risk of trauma and gender-based violence than others, so we have to do everything we can to make sure our resources meet the needs of the survivors that aren't in dominant groups. We think a lot about privacy and how this has often been compromised for people who have experienced things like online abuse. We think about accountability and often how survivors have tried to go to services and places to find help, but their perpetrators haven't been held accountable, and those services haven't always behaved in an accountable way. We think a lot about plurality, so like I said, not flattening people's needs down to just something simple that would work great for us, but something that actually honours survivors' experiences and stories and treats them as people. We think a lot about power sharing. That's obviously essential within inclusive design and social justice. And finally, we think a lot about hope. So how can we actually turn a feeling of hopelessness about one's future and about one's immediate scenario into something that feels much more of a hopeful path towards healing. So these are the things that we're keeping in mind every time we design a service, improve a service, iterate on a service. And they're also things that I'm thinking about a lot when I'm working with survivors in a research way. So how can I help people feel safe when I meet them to talk about products and services we're designing? How can I offer people agency? How can I invite the right people in so that we're designing equitable services? How do I make research feel hopeful? How do I share power? All of these things can be really brought to life through a design lens and through a user research lens as well, and that's my job. And then the final thing, just to say, is often this stuff feels really overwhelming, like, oh, I love the sound of trauma-informed design, but there's so many principles, where do I start and how do I do it? Something that we're always reminding ourselves of is we've been doing this for quite a long time and we're still iterating and evolving our approach. It's definitely not a checklist, so if you don't need to stop what you're doing if you're not doing everything perfectly. Starting somewhere is good. You don't need to apply all of the principles to absolutely everything you're doing. See what feels right and where feels good. And then, yeah, our product, services, and our thinking evolves over time. So these principles aren't the same as they were maybe a few years ago, and they'll change again. But that's the nature of the work that we do. And that's it. Who am I passing on to? Hannah.
Cool, can everyone hear me? Yeah. Nice. So I'm Hannah, I'm a service designer and I work at the Courts and Tribunals Service, which is part of the government. And before that I've worked on gov.uk website and other parts of government. And I'm going to talk a bit about how I've thought about designing for social justice in a government context, which I guess is a bit more restricted in many ways. Just to say, I'm still learning and experimenting, and many people do this work better than me, and just to thank all the people who've helped me learn and develop in this space. So just to start with, as Jenny's touched on, all services have the potential to cause harm to users. Although we don't sit there and think, or I hope we don't sit there and think like, oh, I'm going to design something that's really bad for someone or makes them feel a certain way, sometimes that happens. And that's just a consequence of our design decisions. And this is really important where I'm working in the court service because all court users have the right to equal access to justice, and actually this is part of the rule of law, that everyone has the right to go to court and be treated equally in front of court. And then also as designers we have a lot of power to kind of influence the outcomes that people get from our services. I'm sure other people will touch on this, but we have power over the experience that people go through, what they have to do, things they have to submit, how long the process takes them. So we've got a lot to think about in our roles. So I'm going to briefly touch on 4 ways that I'm trying to design for social justice and support my teams to design for social justice. So the first one is helping designers reflect on their practice and their position within that. The second one is designing and testing new tools that we can use. The third one is designing for internal users as well as external users or end users. The fourth one is reflecting on ways of working and who they include and exclude. So when we think about reflecting on our practice, so in government we have these things called design principles. So as designers we use these things to kind of guide us and make sure we design in a consistent way. So some examples are start with user needs, design with data, do the hard work to make it simple, iterate and iterate again. But these are just kind of principles that we've been given. We don't actually know who created the design principles, and they were created quite a long time ago. So sometimes it's helpful to think about the principles you're using to guide your work and what you're reading, and think about other ways that we can think of what good looks like. And there's many different ways to do this, and there's many people who are doing really good thinking on this. So for example, George A. writes a lot about this. Sasha Constanza Chock writes a lot about this when they talk about design justice. So yeah, it's kind of important to broaden your knowledge about what good design is. So this is, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but this is a screenshot of a workshop I was running with a team where I gave people different design principles and got them to think about how they incorporated this in their work, if they do it, what else they could be doing to add this into their own practice. The second thing I've been trying to do is design and try out new tools and techniques. As designers, there's a lot of tools we can use in our work and a lot of stuff we can find on the internet. And I've been trying to think about how there's other ways we can reflect throughout our projects on what we're doing. So these might include things like reflecting on who our project is serving and not serving at the beginning of a project. Identifying risks and unintended consequences, reflecting on our chosen ideas through different lenses and thinking about who it might harm and who it might advantage. So Again, this is a big screenshot of the workshop I ran to think about unintended consequences of our final design decision we've made, and just to think of the knock-on effects of that. I've also used these barriers. So we have a team in the Ministry of Justice who looks at inclusion. They've developed all these different barriers. This framework, to think about barriers people might face when accessing our services. So they include things like time, support, emotional, mental resources, communicating effectively, and I ran a workshop with the team to think about how our solution or product would affect people facing these barriers. And then a final example I've got is I was thinking about how often our services can make people feel worried or uncertain, and I created this tool to help people reflect on where people might be feeling different emotions throughout the design process, whether we've understood that from research or it's an assumption we have, and then to spot themes across the journey. So then moving on to the third thing and kind of reflecting a bit more inward, been thinking a lot about designing with internal users as well as external users. So it's often easy to build a lot of assumptions into the way that we design for internal users. And often we design things that work for the public, but then we think, okay, if it works best for the public, then it will work best for everyone else. But sometimes it's important to reflect on the people who sit behind that. So in the Courts and Tribunal Service, we have thousands of admin staff who do an amazing job keeping the court system running, and we try and think about those in the design process as well. So an example is, this is a photo I took when I was visiting a office recently, and you can see there's lots of paperwork stacked on shelves, and there's so much paper used within the court service. And it's very easy to think, oh, we're going to make it all digital and then it will be brilliant for admin staff. But actually what we learned from doing this research is that admin staff kind of find the paper fine, and they're a bit fed up of people coming in and doing things to them and assuming that it will make things better for them. And also I think it's interesting to look at how you can work with internal users, and maybe you might have more ability to do things with them that you can't do with external users because they're within your organisation. So sometimes there's a bit more freedom to work with them to design nice solutions. And also I think as designers we often think we know everything, but actually admin staff, well in my organisation, admin staff know a whole lot more about the people who are going through our services than we do. And then the fourth thing is reflecting on our internal tools and who they include and exclude. So design tools can kind of be a way of guarding who gets to do design. So when I talk about design tools, I mean things like we use Miro, which is a virtual whiteboarding tool, things like Mural, things like Figma. There's lots of different software out there which helps us to do our job, and that's great, and sometimes we need to use that. But sometimes we use these tools because they're kind of fashionable, or we make things look nice. They make things look nice, or we can make things look pretty. But also it's important to reflect on that and think about whether we're using the best tools for the job and whether we're using accessible tools, because a lot of these design tools aren't accessible. So this is a screenshot that I took of a Miro board that I made, and on the board I had a big kind of like spider diagram that showed different relationships between people. But what I realised is if I was using a high level of zoom on my computer, I actually would find it quite hard to use the board because I'd try and travel between these like bits on the map and I wouldn't be able to see the whole picture, so I might get lost on the way. And there's someone called Marion Avery who does a lot of good work around accessibility and design tools. But yeah, by doing this I've kind of stopped some people from participating in the design process. And if someone who was using this level of zoom wanted to use my map that I've made or comment on it or add to it, it would be quite difficult for them. So I think it's important to reflect on those tools you're using and yeah, maybe think of more accessible alternatives. So just an example that probably isn't perfect, but I was making a journey map and I decided to make it in Excel. So I've got two different rows, and one of them shows the organisation and systems, and one of them shows the journey that people go through, which is probably a more accessible format than like a big, massive Miro board for this. So yeah, I think it's important to think about how you're designing and the way you're designing and who can participate in that, and also how your design work lives on beyond you, which is important, and actually who you don't know who's going to pick up that work in the future and yeah, want to work on it. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you everybody for coming to the talk, and I'd just like to give some reflections on my own experiences of working in transdisciplinary teams in India to address the global problem of antimicrobial resistance and the importance of reflexivity for us to understand our own positionality when undertaking research in diverse cultural contexts. Why is positionality important? Design now is being adopted globally, and it's often used now in the global south with very little consideration about these very Eurocentric and or North American design approaches. Similarly, we are increasingly required to work with groups of people in terms of different specialisms and with communities with diverse cultural backgrounds. And just to give an example, most of my work is working with microbiologists, chemists, diagnostic specialists, clinicians. And so the cultural divide is not just between geographic locations, it can be very much between different disciplinary viewpoints and what is considered to be evidence and truth within research. For this reason, researchers need to see themselves as, researchers, instead of seeing themselves as neutral, we really need to acknowledge and disclose ourselves, really, in order to understand the impact of what we're having on a context and also in the research process. By doing this, it really enables us to really not privilege one form of knowledge over another, because as, in fact, the last speaker said, we all have assumptions about how we go into a place, and we can make terrible assumptions and also then draw the wrong conclusions about what we're seeing and how we're representing people. So really, we need to challenge our own positionality, and by doing so, we then challenge our ontological assumptions and also our epistemological assumptions. In other words, what counts as knowledge, how we interact with the environment, how are people interacting with animals, with their own, within their own family networks. We need to understand and question our position before we go into these areas, and to start, again, recording other people's ways of living. So from my own positionality, I'm a mixed heritage. I'm Eurasian. My mother's from Sri Lanka. I've got Irish and English mix as well thrown in. I'm white, middle class. But actually, again, my background in terms of my education is very hybrid. I came from arts, science, then into design, and then actually I'm bridging both those worlds. So again, in terms of how you end up in a place, you need to consider how you got there. So I'm just going to draw on two projects. One was DARPI, Drivers of Antimicrobial Resistance in Poultry in India, and the other one, Dosed Diagnostics for a One Health Solution to AMR. And of course, AMR is often seen as a biological problem. What does this mean? It means that actually it is seen very much as about disease, dirt, scientific evidence. But in fact, what we know is that AMR is very much about practices, networks, and structures. And it's also very much defined by, again, our interactions with places. So one of the first things that we encountered, and this work started a number of years ago, and when you're really the non-scientist in the team, initially the conversations can be very driven by, again, the language of the disciplines which are familiar with AMR. So we were actually asked to go and visit farms, and the big emphasis was on biosecurity. We need to understand biosecurity on these farms. The farmers, what practices are they using? How are they controlling disease? And of course, what we actually identified is that biosecurity is a global yardstick for good practice on farms, but in fact this is a very easily misunderstood term. It's actually very ill-defined when it's translated into Hindi. And the only way we could actually have a conversation about biosecurity was to visualize the different elements. This was translated into the local language. And then actually we gave these to the farmers, who then actually moved around their farms talking about, oh yes, we have rodents, but it's the wild birds we're very worried about, wild birds coming in and spreading disease. And it was only in this way that we could understand that this notion of bounded spaces, which is a very much a Eurocentric view around clean spaces and dirty spaces, and the fact that you can be contained, is very, very removed from the reality of people farming in the global south. So we actually had a paper published on this, a visualization tool to understand disease prevention and control practices of stakeholders working along the poultry supply chain in southern India. Something I've just read, actually, I hope it's not going to push me over time, is actually when papers are published in social sciences, in terms of academics producing papers in the global north, they never mention a location, and they always go for universal statements so that they will get high citations. In this global south, when they're published, they're always located in place, so it restricts the number of readers. So actually we have these imbalances of power even playing out in the way that we publish academically, and that's something, again, that we need to be very conscious of. So again, on the DOSA project, and we've got follow-on funding for this, we have actually developed a community-based test for urinary tract infections. And again, we were working with our Indian partners who are all microbiologists, and the first bit of field work was actually all about UTI. And we had teams going into northeast India and Assam asking about UTI, and the feedback was there is no UTI. My colleague, Delina Evans, who actually I should credit also, and Dimitri, for the two researchers who were working with me on this team, on these projects, we said, let's just stop asking about UTI. It's not about UTI. What does it mean to be well? What does it mean to be unwell? How do we understand symptoms? And again, we created a visualization of the symptoms of the card for UTI. This is translated into Bengali. And we took that back into the communities. And we showed this, and of course, everybody actually said, oh, I have this, I have that. And also it meant that people could mediate the conversation without the stigma of having to actually discuss their own personal symptoms themselves. And this has become part of our solution. And here we're co-designing with the Ashers, who are accredited social health activists, and we've been working with them now for 4 years. We're doing a performance trial in India at the moment. Again, working absolutely collaboratively with them, who go into the community and have been working with the prototypes. We take their ideas back, and we've been iterating. But it's really about always challenging your assumptions, even over the terminology. When you're working with scientists and medical experts, whether they're from India or from the UK, they're trained in a global language around disease and management, and we have to really examine that. So the other thing that's very important is understand these multiple knowledge forms that we come across. So in the West, we really separate mind and body. And when we were doing the field work outside a primary healthcare centre, there's a herbal garden, and natural remedies are very, very prominent within local knowledge. So one of the things we've done, again, with our solution is amplify that local knowledge in terms of managing the symptoms and treatments of UTI and the prevention. Outside a microbiology lab, we have a deity of Vishwakarma, who is the deity, the god of knowledge and engineering. And again, that's this mixture of belief systems with scientific, hard biological data that is being undertaken in the medical school, but there's still a place for belief systems to be very strongly placed and a part of, again, cleaning the practices of the lab on the day of the deity's celebration. All of this is entangled together. And then also visiting a dairy farm and seeing this hanging over the doorway, and this was a dried fish, and this was to ward off foot and mouth disease. So where this led Delina, Dimitri, and myself in terms of our thinking is that from this work, we were shocked actually initially by some of the conversations we were having to have with our team members around actually going in with these very accepted views about designing the research, what was evidence, how you engage with the community. So we developed these tools that would again allow people to discuss their positionality before they go into the field. These are actually published in the Routledge Book of Design Methods, but we will put some up on our website so that when it comes, so that you can play around with them. They have been used by some of my colleagues at Northumbria and across other courses. There's another template which actually again is questioning actually what's your position around looking at these photographs in an environment? How do you understand the relationship between the individuals yourself and what you're seeing there in terms of water, cleanliness, food preparation? What sort of ideas do you have, and what do you need to consider when you're going into these different contexts? And finally, we have cultural frames where we ask people to think about actually what are they actually looking at in terms of the different relationships and gender roles within context. How do we actually overcome and include people who might be excluded within a village? How do we build the relationships and understand the power dynamics that also exist within the community? So, thank you.
Now I can keep my go.
Thank you. Sorry.
Hello. Oh, yeah. So I'm going to talk very quickly around some work that I did in a previous role around pediatric palliative care. It's been a really good invitation for me to think back on this project and through the lens of social justice. So that's kind of where I'll go. I'll do it through a very specific project that we did. So yeah, my name is Ivor. I'm a designer. Until November, I was the lead for end-of-life care at a place called the Institute for Global Health Innovation at Imperial College. I still remain there as an honorary fellow, but I really spent the last 10 years working at the intersection of design and health and human experience, and I'm particularly drawn to the kind of universal substrate of the human experience, and that is where I've been doing a lot of work around end-of-life care, palliative care, and death, dying, and loss. But this project in particular is again, reflecting on this is really interesting for me. When I did this work, I wasn't a parent. I'm now a parent. So reflecting on the approaches we had to supporting children with life-limiting diseases has completely shifted in my mind. So it's been a really nice chance to kind of reflect on this. I guess the starting point for this work that we did in children's hospice care was exploring how design could improve the experience of children and families who might be receiving pediatric palliative care. And two things from the project, as we explored it, were really important, and I think kind of underpin this idea of justice and kind of human rights in a way. The first is that every child has a right to play, regardless of their ability or function or kind of capabilities. And I think to have that enshrined at a kind of global level is really significant. And when I was thinking back on this project and looking a bit more, there was a supplementary right which has been not through the UN, but a supplementary right by called the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature. They proposed that children should have the right to connect to nature. And so thinking about this project, reaffirming why I think the work that we did here was really significant was it kind of it designed a space for children of all abilities to do exactly that, to connect with nature. So for background, the work was around children's hospice care. If you're unfamiliar with the kind of concept, in a nutshell, around the world, 360,000 babies are born every day. Most live entirely normal lives, but a small percentage of them face life-limiting illnesses, either through kind of in utero genetic disorders or diseases that present themselves, right from the moment of conception and are carried through genetic diseases. Or often children might be born healthy and develop cancers or kind of other kind of degenerative diseases as they kind of grow up. So there's, for this minority of children and babies, the need for palliative care is really essential. Palliative care basically being a form of medicine that doesn't seek to cure someone of a disease, but rather can support them to have the highest quality life that they can for as long as possible. And palliative care in children and babies is particularly significant around this idea of life quality. So no matter how long a child may survive, that they have the best life possible. And palliative care at its best really is holistic in that it kind of covers the physical needs, it covers the emotional, social, and spiritual needs of a person. And that's where things like play becomes really important for children. And this idea of end-of-life support is inclusive of the child, but also the family that is affected and the networks of people around them. But the problem for children's hospice care is that there is chronically, systemically a lack of the kind of structures of either formal and informal healthcare systems that support children around the world. And that's kind of partly one of the reasons why we did this work. And also, additional to that is the idea that when there are services, they're completely strained by the demand and the need for the kind of holistic care that is really kind of demanded in palliative care. So there's kind of structural problems that make that kind of care very hard to do. And it's in that kind of environment that we did that work. And we did this work through a partner in Italy, the Seragnoli Foundation. They were developing a new children's hospice in Bologna. And one of the kind of, if you can imagine designing something from the ground up, designing a brand new service, a new healthcare kind of service in Europe, but certainly in most countries outside of the UK benefits from having one of the most advanced kind of hospice sectors in the world. Most European countries have a very underdeveloped hospice sector, and especially children's hospice sector. And the need for these things is really kind of immense. And one of the things that really struck us with this project is this idea of building in natural connection, building in relationships to nature that can really be part of a healing process for children and families. And so the kind of structural nature of this hospice was an inspiration for us to work as closely with nature as possible. And so that's why we looked at things like horticultural therapy. It's why we were using technology as an expressed way to support accessibility for children with, say, very limited mobility or kind of developmental problems. And so the kind of project that I'll just very briefly touch on is what we call the Connected Garden. And it's a really interesting project for me to kind of reflect on because it was in one way a very practical prototyping project where we spent time in hospices, spent time with children, spent time in the kind of the places of care, and identified ways for us to improve the accessibility of play and games for children with limited mobility, to discover ways for children and siblings to play together, to kind of discover opportunities for us to integrate the kind of natural world into places which are generally very medicalized. And that was a really, it's in and of itself a very specific design prototype project, which was admittedly very fun to work with and to work with children making this game, essentially turning a plant into a computer game and using capacitive touch to allow plants themselves to become controllers where children with very limited mobility can actually interact and play with games and computer games that we made on screen. So, as a designer, kind of fun thing to work on. But in respect to this kind of context, I've been thinking about how social justice and well-being kind of intersect. And so reading about Madison Powers and Ruth Fadden's work, they kind of say that, they describe that a just society basically should aim to ensure a sufficient level of well-being for all its members and prioritizing those who are least well off. And least well off usually is described in economic terms. But they describe 6 dimensions around health, security, reasoning, respect, attachment, and self-determination. And what I thought was really interesting about this lens of social justice in regards to children's hospice, and particularly this project, was kind of, I wouldn't like to say retrospectively, but it kind of taps into a feeling that I had at the time, which was how children's palliative care can really be described as a social justice issue. And in this project in particular being really kind of interesting to see how we could intersect those 6 dimensions in this project. And it was quite interesting how well they kind of actually were quite congruent in the idea of trying to build a technology that improved accessibility for children, was around kind of improving social bonds, was about kind of promoting independence and autonomy for children with very limited abilities, to kind of build something which was previously underserved and underdeveloped. So I think, again, a very brief summary. There's I'm proud of the paper that we co-authored around the same time 2 years ago now. If you're interested, which kind of dives far deeper into the issues of children's palliative care that we published at Imperial. And that takes a far larger global view of it all, because I think that the one thing that we learned as well was taking kind of Eurocentric view on the needs of children at the end of life really incredibly varies across the world, as you might imagine, and how much those issues of social justice vary and are so contextually driven by the cultures and societies that support children at the end of life. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Hello. Hold on, let me just test if this works. Oh, sorry. It's not very clever, is it? Hold on. Hi. Hello. I'm Megha. And I'm going to be talking about increasing access to social justice through design rather than social justice alone. So a little bit about me. I'm Megha. I'm from India. I studied design in both India and the UK, in fact, LCC. Shout out to Alison, my first service design mentor. And since then, I've been basically working in design for like an odd 12 years now. I co-developed a social design short course with the Social Design Institute at UAL with Jocelyn, and a lot of the thinking on the slides are also from there. So thinking about this lovely invitation that Silvia sent, social justice through a design lens was an important framework for me to understand how to think about this. And what I realized is that primarily when we talk about social justice, we often talk about it through a front-end lens, so from a more end-user experience, about how it aims to create that positive social change by designing equitable services, which a lot of the speakers have talked about, but also how recognizing that the most effective solutions will often be designed and delivered at a local level, which Alison was also alluding to. What is often not talked about is the conditions for that work to take place. And that was something which was interesting for me to talk about. Oh. Something has happened. Hold on. Oh, no. It was about to go to sleep. It's okay. Also unpacking this a bit more, it's important to remember, particularly from that social design lens, that there are different versions of social and design. And they're all true, which is why it is often quite difficult sometimes to think about those conditions or how to even work out what some of the tools and methods and approaches are. So it's not to say that there's one particular exclusive method. However, what is quite common across all of these is that there is always that lens of how design and social impact and influence each other and how they respond to each other, which in some ways helps us work out how you can start thinking about creating conditions for social design and then justice even. So thinking about how design shapes the social, and we know this a lot, right? So when you think about design, you know how it shapes our behaviors, perceptions, identities through different symbols, affordances, and objects. This screenshot was my frustration when I was trying to open a fixed saving account with a bank, and I realized I couldn't because I have an Indian passport. I do not have a UK passport or a driving license and therefore not eligible, even though I've been living in this country for so many years. So this is an example of how my identity was essentially being informed to me by a particular, I guess, design choice in some ways. But thinking of it from a service lens particularly, what is really important is, and this is sort of quite known to, I guess, most of you all in this space, and I think a lot of service designers often talk about this, is how a good service is about understanding that experience for end users in an end-to-end way, so that, from the point that they start becoming aware of what they want to do to when they achieve their goal. But equally, what is really important is how that service operates front to back, so how that connects to the systems, the policies, the processes, and the different teams. And we sort of heard a lot about that from Hannah as well today. But this becomes really complex when you're thinking about not just designing one service, but multiple services, particularly multiple services for multiple groups. And this screenshot is from a piece of work that we did for Essex quite some years back, which was around identifying commonalities and patterns across these multiple services. And you can sort of start essentially seeing, and this was really sort of very detailed work, quite a lot of hard work, and what sort of came out of it was learning that essentially, particularly in the public sector and in government, most services are actually trying to do similar things in some ways, essentially, but they are designed quite differently even, or different teams are delivering them in different ways. And that essentially creates a lot of challenges and issues for users. And that becomes even more compounded when you think of people sort of having different challenges, or people sort of having, I guess, different contexts, different life conditions. So this is why the concept of service patterns becomes really important. This is a bit of a high level of what do service patterns sort of look like. Essentially, they are replicable parts of a service that can be reused to design services so that they feel more consistent. And recently, we worked with DWP, where we identified these service patterns and sub-service patterns. Shout out to Helen and Lindsay from DWP, who are amazing and are carrying on that work now, to test this better with some cross-government departments. But what we sort of learned with this work was how DWP, like other government departments, had multiple services that were often disjointed. And when you think about the users, particularly vulnerable users who might be applying for benefits, these disjointed services can have quite a significant impact on their lives. And when you multiply that particularly with people who might be in those vulnerable spaces where they might be on multiple benefits, imagine them going through this at multiple, through multiple channels at multiple junctions. So that's the impact of that is really compounded. And this is why sort of when you're thinking about service patterns, it's quite important because we're not just thinking of an individual designer for service, but you're thinking about connecting how services can work at a more policy level, and it can start create that evidence for policies and how that sort of can have an impact on social justice. Sorry, I didn't say that correctly, but anyways. So that's why reflecting on that previous statement of how social justice is about creating that positive social change by designing equitable services. Strategic design governance tools like service patterns can actually build user-centered evidence, particularly for policies and for future services that influence social justice. And we certainly saw that in the work that we've been doing, where essentially we're able to now bring in multiple teams, departments, and policymakers and start seeing that impact of the work, which starts then informing how we can essentially deliver that. So the second part, which is social design shapes the design. I'm going to go really fast now. Alison talked a lot about this. And we definitely know this is true, that design is that social practice shaped by its context and participants. So I will not go into too much detail here, but I will show this very quick ladder of participation, which I'm sure many of you might be familiar with. Just to say that public participation and consultation is really not new in the public sector. This is from 1969, and it's still being used today to inform and influence public participation. But what becomes really interesting is when you combine democratic approaches like participation and consultation, which has been used in government, with design. And we sort of have been seeing that as part of the work we've been doing in citizen assemblies as a deliberative approach. So citizen assemblies are really interesting because they are a part of a more democratic process where citizens are given the time, the resources to really learn and reflect and discuss a topic in depth. This is a bit different from co-design or sort of other approaches. Of course, we can learn from each other, and often, you can sort of find those overlaps in there. But the design for these citizen assemblies really includes who takes part. So they're often participants who are brought in through something called sortition. So they reflect a population of a particular place, which gives them legitimacy as a tool to think about governance. The assembly process is very much about giving people a lot of knowledge and tools and getting them to learn about a particular topic before they can really reflect, discuss, and come up with some decisions and understand the consequences of those decisions even. And lastly, the information that is provided in these places is usually quite balanced. So it wouldn't just be geared towards one ideology or one viewpoint, but it's actually talking about different perspectives. So one example was the work that we did way back, many years ago, with Camden, and this was my introduction to citizen assemblies. And this was a really interesting piece of work because over sort of several months, we basically came up with multiple ideas that were taken forward around health and well-being in a local area. So this was a very interesting tool for ideation. Just one slide. But what was really interesting was to develop on this further recently. My colleague, sort of like Hannah, led the design for these assemblies for South Yorkshire. And essentially what was really cool was that rather than just talking about ideas and getting people to come up with them, it was bringing in 30 contributors across the region around climate change and breaking that down into particular sub-themes, partially because climate change is so systemic, so huge, but also because so many ideas already exist in that space. So rather than getting people to create their own ideas, it was essentially about using these prompts to understand how these ideas can be implemented, what are some of the conditions that people would accept them, what are people's red lines around them. And that really helped inform those policies and help, I guess, those places reach some consensus around what could be done, because that was a real challenge rather than ideas alone. So my last slide is about essentially recognizing that the most effective solutions will often be designed and delivered at a local level, yes, but also deliberative approaches create that mandate for social justice, because a mandate is so important in these spaces as well. Thank you.
done. Yep. Brilliant. Hi. So I get to take you down the home stretch, which is lovely. So my name's Becca. I'm a family worker. I'm an often frazzled mum of two. I'm a doctoral student in professional social work practice, and I'm a non-designer. So if anyone doesn't care what I've got to say, you can just have a quick nap and then get back to these guys that know what they're talking about. But I think what's quite lovely about the way that Silvia's teed this up is that I get to talk to you guys through the other end of the lens, which is about my experience as a non-designer, as a public servant, working with designers on a particular project that I'll talk to you about in a moment. And to think about the ways in which we can use methods and processes that can bend and flex to address power asymmetry, to flatten knowledge hierarchy and promote knowledge democracy. And even though this project isn't about that, when I reflect back on it, it's now 2 years old, I think those are the things that we did. So let me introduce you quickly to the project. And this is how I come to know Silvia. So back in, oh, blimey, late 2020, 2021? Late 2021. We're kind of, part way through COVID. First lockdowns happened, second lockdowns happened. We're starting to sort of emerge into somewhere. And do you remember that awful time around October, November when it was all getting a bit ropey? And people were asking me, what does family support look like after a pandemic? And I genuinely had no idea. I mean, I'm very qualified to talk about family support. I've done it for 20 years. My doctoral research is in it. But I had no idea what family support for the extraordinary communities of Camden, and I say that genuinely, it's such an honour of my life to serve the communities of Camden. I had no idea what family support needed to look like after COVID. So we decided to put that in the hands of the community because they know themselves best. They have lived that experience. They've lived that COVID experience. And they know the storms that were coming after it. And myself and a colleague, Tim Fisher, we do a lot of work on co-design and participatory work. So we were kind of really cool with that element of it. But previously, earlier on in the pandemic, being quite the nerd, I got quite into design justice. I'd been to some amazing work that the wonderful Fazana Khan at Healing Justice London had been doing. I'd been to a number of lectures and online pieces of work that the Design Justice Network had run. So it had become a bit of a personal passion of mine. And when I was thinking about how we might do this, I kind of felt all right with the participation bit. What I didn't know was design. So we reached out to UAL, and I got to spend some time with Silvia and with Adam Thorpe. And in my head, I'm thinking, maybe they'll just give me a couple of students who might like to do it as a topic. Silvia actually said, how about I give you 32 master's students who use this as their curriculum project for the term? To which I went, all right. Not having any idea what that meant at the time, but it suddenly became this enormous, beautiful, glorious, chaotic, messy, beautiful thing. Because not only that, we had a group, an expert group of parents and carers that were recruited for the project that came from across the borough, a whole range of ethnicities. We have 156 languages and dialects spoken in Camden, extraordinary place, incredibly diverse. So we had that. We had an expert group and a sounding board. We had community leaders that were going to be part of this to provide challenge. But the whole point of it was to use participatory design and service design and design justice principles to create this design vision for good help for families after COVID. And the idea was that the students and the parents would kind of work collaboratively to create this design vision together. 2 days before the project was due to start, they announced the third national COVID lockdown. Now, here's my first reflection on where you have to bend and flex your methodologies and your methods in design in order to stay true to your justice principles. The easiest thing to do would have been to cancel the project. Instead, we rang some friends in a local voluntary organisation and said, have you got any laptops going spare? Because, of course, many of our members of our expert parent panel, they had no laptops at home. All the kids needed them for school. They weren't going to be able to use them for this. And there was some lovely pictures of me trudging around Hampstead Hill, carrying around suitcases full of laptops to take them to our community members. So there's something in there about practicing justice and equity by not letting the hard things knock you off course, but being able to pivot towards what needs to change. There's a beautiful little film, which I'm not going to show today because it's quite long. And I also now can't get the tech to work. I'm going the wrong way. Hold on, there we go. So why design and where did local government fit into this? Now, this is maybe 3 years ago now, and Camden was just beginning on a design journey. It's now made a really conscious, intentional commitment to building capability around design and participation into local government. I've got a link for you later if you want to find out a bit more about what Camden's doing, but this is back in the day. We started the conversation around participation and how we could bring participation and design together. It turned into, I think, a conversation much more around social justice values. Camden as a place is incredibly proud of its heritage in social justice. Communities really do believe in the motto, not for self, but for all. There's a collectivism that exists in Camden, indeed in many other London boroughs. I can only speak for my own. And so we wanted to make sure that we built social justice values into the work that we were doing. So I'm thinking about where there was this reciprocity. It wasn't that the design students came in or that Silvia came in with this very mechanical kind of process and said, do this. There was a bend and a form that and a mutual recognition and respect that the two sides were bringing together. So from the design side, that design thinking gave us form and structure and the creativity and the extraordinary talent of the students and tangible solutions. That prototyping gave us the tangibility that we were looking for. But what the design guys did, and I'm forever grateful to you for this, because you didn't have to do this, but you recognised that recognition and respect between the two of us as well, was that what local government brought was our practices in systemic and reflective practice. So what you can see here is something that we introduced into the design process very early on. Bear in mind, our parent expert group have just gone into a lockdown. They've got all their kids at home. It's hard enough when you live in a 11th floor flat with no access to open space during a lockdown. So we wanted to build in some narrative therapy techniques into the design process to try and create the kind of safety that you were talking about earlier on, that sense of connection and belonging that you get in person when you're doing stuff, but when you're trying to translate all of this online, that sense of connection and belonging is so much harder. So what you're looking at here is a beautiful technique called Tree of Life from narrative therapy work. Can't recommend it highly enough, which are two incredible interns, which UAL also provided. At this point, they provided the Miro board, and we created the Tree of Life as a method to support the beginning of the design process to do what you were talking about, which is to apply that trauma-sensitive lens. My reflections on the whole thing, and Silvia asked me to think about my reflections on design as a non-designer. I think the biggest thing for me was that sense of reciprocity and that sense of proper collaboration, that it wasn't that the designers came in and said, hey, we're the experts in design, you need to follow this kind of learning journey, but that there was a reciprocal respect that was built in all the way through. And that collaboration of learning, I think, was incredibly important. The third one down, I really want to pick up on because there's a funny story attached to it. But when we talk about one of the features of design justice being around maximising resources and building capacity, another example of how the design process supported that. When we had to move the whole thing online, of course, none of us, all of you guys know how to use Miro. We didn't even know what it was. So we thought, okay, how are we going to handle this? Because we can either reduce, it can be an incredibly reductive thing to kind of sit there and somebody else put your sticky notes onto a Miro board. But actually, no, we wanted to learn. And our expert parent group wanted to learn. So we decided one evening that we would just kind of have a bit of a drink and learn. And when I say drink and learn, some of it was alcoholic, I'm teetotal. But you brought whatever beverage you want, right? And we all just joined in and learned how to use Miro. And it was one of the funniest nights of my lockdown experience, with the sight of us trying to stick sticky notes everywhere. The point being, it was another way that we flattened this kind of knowledge hierarchy. We're going to learn together. And that particular point, I think, is also important. It was deeply respectful that we were practicing this principle of no knowledge hierarchy and knowledge democracy at all times. Information can flow both ways. As another example, we were planning the second or third session, I forget which, and the intern that we were working with, Angela, said, God, I wonder what the children think of all this. The children's voices were nowhere in this project, the expert parent group and carer group. So we pivoted again to create a kind of activity challenge once or twice a fortnight for the kids to join in. When they brought their voices in, they did it through artwork, they did it through song, they did it through media. when you brought the children's voices in, you got a completely other perspective that you would never have got before. Again, I think it's sometimes about that conscious intentionality to realize or to think, to turn it in on yourself and saying, am I practicing true justice methodology here? And if I'm not, who is being left out? Who might be being harmed? And then pivoting your methodologies to make space. Like, we had a pretty packed agenda over the 10 weeks of the project, but and the final thing I'll say before I close is the other thing that I really valued that we built in was something that I'm calling a justice and equity reflective pause. That's fancy words for picking up on some of the Design Justice Network and Costanda Chock's approach, was every now and again at the end of a workshop we would stop and ask ourselves just really simple questions. In this thing that we've worked on today, who has power and who doesn't? Is anyone being harmed? Is anything that we've done today accidentally reinforcing existing oppressive systems? And if so, what can we do to turn that back the other way? And in light of that, what might we do differently in how we're thinking about this next iteration of the work? So there are some really simple things I think that you can build into your practices, and that reflexive turn to turn it back on yourself being one of them. The final thing I will say, because it mattered a lot, there's something for me about quiet your cleverness. Like, we all want to be the clever one in the room. What I loved about the master's students was they were as open to learning from the parents as the parents were from them. So there's something about being prepared to just quiet your cleverness a little bit. And the relationships was what made it work. There was an extraordinary humility that all parties brought to the table, including, I have to say, Silvia and Veron and all of the team, that it was a relational experience, not a design experience. The design came as a consequence of the work that went in to the depth and the quality of the relationships. So thank you very much for your time. Hope it's been useful.
Okay, if you give us just 1 minute, we will rearrange the chairs here and turn this into a panel, and then we'll have some panel discussion. I have a few questions that I put together initially, and then I'll open it to the floor. Okay, so I'm gonna... Oh. I'm going to start from a question that I think kind of was highlighted by what Hannah said, and it was about, as designers, we have power over the experience and outcomes. And I think it would be nice to articulate that a little bit more. Like, in what ways do you think, as designers, we do have power? Because often you feel powerless when you're not actually the main decision maker or the final decision maker. As well as, in what ways do you share power with stakeholders or with people affected by the design? Anyone want to take it first? Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the really important parts of designing and doing research in a trauma-informed way is thinking about power sharing and thinking about positionality, which a lot of people have talked about tonight, and thinking about the identities that you hold as a researcher and as a designer as compared to the types of identities that people you're designing for and with might hold. And then thinking about like the amount of power that you have in the interaction as well. So as a researcher, I'm showing up to a session, I've got the questions, I know what the order is going to be, I know what the structure is going to be, I know how it might feel. And so why not take the step of sharing some of that stuff with participants in advance so that they can get a feel for, you know, how the session might feel, what they're going to be asked, and they'll have some say as well in that and some agency. So I will really strongly encourage people to say, like, I do want to talk about these topics, I don't want to talk about these ones. I'll ask people, like, are there specific words and phrases that you would particularly like me to use or avoid when we chat? And that's really important when you think about language justice and the ideas that people have around, like, their own agency when it comes to their story. So when we talk about things like sexual assault, one of the things that we say at Chen is we don't use the word victim because we think that's not very empowering. We use the word survivor, but we know not everybody likes that word or appreciates being labelled with that. So what would you like us to use, and are there specific words that you definitely want us to avoid? And people really like to come back with ideas on that. So I think they're all like small touches, like things that you can do as a researcher to help people feel as though they have a bit more power. And also just changing the sessions as well. So like there's a tendency to be like, you have to do an hour and a half co-design session and it's got to be this long, otherwise you're not going to learn enough. But we'll often give people lots of options and say, no need to have video on. We anticipate people will often change their mind on the day. We'll design different ways for people to engage, so it doesn't always have to be an interview. So I think, there's a lot within that you can do to help people like feel heard and take part in research without it being, these traditional, quite academic or old school ways of engaging.
I'd probably just add something to that about the choices you make around agency for people. And just to give kind of 2 examples, I was really struck by you talking about creating as many opportunities to lift people's agency wherever possible. And kind of 2 examples of that with Family Changemakers. Of course, we were supposed to be doing it in a community hall and then had to move online. And we were canvassing people about, all right, well, what time of day would work best for you? And you had half the group of people that said, well, morning is the only time that's going to work for me, and another group that said, I can only do after the children have gone to bed. Now, you can make a conscious choice in there to say one or the other, or you can choose to do both. Now, it's going to put you out a little bit. Yeah, it's going to take up more of your time, but that's about the agency of the person that you're working with rather than making it about you and what works best for you. And the other example, again, about this question of kind of flattening power asymmetries and making choices. You remember when the students were showing their prototypes, and we made a decision, didn't we, that you, I think, lined up a number of industry experts that they could talk to from the design perspective, but you incredibly generously also let me put community leaders from Camden in front of them so they could test them within the context of the community that they were designing for. Which is a choice. You could have said, actually, no, that we don't need to do that. But you brought the lived experience and the community real world view into that arena rather than flattening it off and saying, actually, no, it's only industry experts that would have a view on this.
And their view was so valuable. Which,
Can I just add one thing on that as well? I think, is this working? It really touches on what our ideas of professionalism are as well. So when I used to work in more commercial design settings, there'd be like a very specific way of doing research. And it had to be quite polished, and you'd have stakeholders joining, and it had, you felt under a lot of pressure as a researcher for the interview to go well, so that you could show that you'd learned something. And then I started to work more in the field of trauma, and I'd have people saying, well, I'm going to join from my car because that's where I feel safer, or I'm going to join the session from my workplace, or it'll be late at night when my kids are in bed. And you learn quite quickly that like your ideas of what you think is professional are so not important compared to like what people feel safe to do. And inviting those kinds of scenarios in, so saying you can choose when we speak, and not only the time but also the place, and we encourage you to do that, is something I've learned a lot about over the past 5 or so years.
I'm just thinking in terms of this issue of power that plays out. So sort of picks up, Becky, in terms of what you were saying, that when COVID arrived, we had been working very closely with the Ashers in Assam, and it had been really mutual in terms of our learning, and every time we went, and our partners from Assam University and Silchar Medical School built a great relationship with the accredited social health activists who go out into the village, and they're sort of the first point of care for mainly for the women in the villages. But we wanted to continue the research, and one of the ways we suggested doing this was actually to buy smartphones for 18 of them. Oh my goodness, did this open a can of worms for the research councils. But we can't be buying mobile phones. I said, no, they're going to be, they've been actively involved in the research. They would like to continue with us. We've had conversations. They're willing to go out when they're in the villages, and we've got these. We created these visual templates for data collection, and actually that took a real challenge to change people's mindsets about you can't be. And it reminds me from years ago, like Lewisham Council when they first did an app for My Clean Streets. And it was almost like the waste disposal people, they can't have mobile phones, they can't have smartphones. Why would you be giving them? And it was the same thing with the ashes. And the research officials say, well, you can't be spending money on this equipment. And it was like, actually, they are the ones who, are actively wanting to participate. We've been dependent on their knowledge. And in fact, we did get the mobile phones. It was a hugely drawn out process and the risk wasn't on the university. It was all shifted, but we got them. And actually it was also showing that you were willing to change the rules over what is accepted practice in order to get things done. And it meant also that they were very appreciative of just actually being respected for being active members of the team, and that they needed equipment to do this work. So I just wanted to...
I think there's something really interesting about power, because it's important to remember that it exists everywhere and it exists for everybody. So it's not about power being good or bad in many ways. It's also important to be quite self-reflective and be quite self-aware of course, your own power, but it's equally important to remember what you can influence and affect and what you can't, and not beat yourself up over it, because there's so many designers that I see that get completely disheartened after a point. So I think that there's a lot here about relationship building. There's a lot here about building trust. There's a lot here about being self-aware. But equally, I think it's equally important to start understanding how to grow your own circle of influence, and to start sort of like being able to be in that place where you can shift those dynamics a bit more and be more self-aware, and if not, to at least surface them for those who are, I guess, most in need of having that lack of power in some ways.
I have another question, which is about kind of how do you get buy-in from decision makers for this type of work, as well as what trade-offs there might have been in that context of getting buy-in for working in a slightly different way.
I think this is a very good question. I think especially it's interesting working in government, where we're often a bit more constrained and we can't just go and do everything we want to do. I think there's a few ways you can approach it. So part of it is about like that circle of influence thing. I think it's thinking about what people, what more senior decision makers are looking for, and thinking about how what you're doing ties into that, because a lot of this work does. So often we see people are trying to like reduce costs in something because, say for example, there's a service and a lot of things are going wrong, so they have to keep recontacting people who are applying and tell them to do something new. But if you've designed in a way that's, if you've designed in a better way and you've designed with users, then it's more likely to work for them and there's less likely to be that kind of failure. So I think it's thinking about that. I think part of it as well is thinking about where your expertise is and actually like what your niche is and how you can change things within that without people picking up on it. So for example, like recently been working on a form and with some of the smaller design things, we kind of know that if we change them, people won't really notice because they're not designers, but actually they will make a big difference for people. And sometimes it's thinking about which of your like smaller wins will actually make a big difference to communities. So on this form, for example, it had title fields for everyone, so it was asking like, are you Mr.? I think it just said, are you Mr. or Mrs.? It was very outdated. And then we were like, well, what's going to happen if we remove these fields? And no one had an answer. They were like, oh, we like to put people's Mr. or Mrs. on the letters. And we're like, well, what happens if you don't? And they were like, nothing. So I think it's like thinking about those things and thinking where your expertise lies, and within that, like, what are the levers you can pull, and kind of asking for forgiveness, not permission.
I'd say that it's quite a long journey too. I think this idea of the network of influence takes time. You're building it at many different levels, so a lot of it may be building trust through your partners who are usually fairly well connected and they're having discussions, but it's getting the opportunity with the senior district health commissioner so that they understand what you're doing, keeping them informed and actually presenting back to them as well as the ashes, and to keep everybody almost, it's like spinning plates in terms of what's going on. And when you reflect back, you realise that it wasn't a linear process, that you do, at points you get pushed back from maybe more traditional experts in the medical college, but actually again, by going back and keeping them in the conversation, they also came round to the ways that we were working, which was very inclusive and very on the ground, which was very unfamiliar to them. And also we always had really nice snacks and amazing lunches when we didn't, and it was also just having that time where with the ashes, going also to the point you were making about, when people are ready to talk, that we didn't really go with, surveys. We went for conversations, and over time, the ashes really just opened. They would actually talk amongst ourselves, and we were having it translated as those conversations were happening. And that's how we learned so much about their expertise in natural remedies, how they dealt with women in the community who were, again, didn't go to primary healthcare centres. All that rich story came through by really creating social spaces for them. So I think, you're not going in with a very strict mindset of almost, what does formal research look like? You've got to be very serendipitous and very open to what will emerge.
I think a lot of this is about, I think speaks to what Alison was slightly talking about in her presentation as well, which is the different languages that people around us speak. Sometimes it's very important to remember that there is a difference between designers speaking design for, say, justice's sake, versus trying to understand what everybody is trying to work towards. So it's not necessarily changing your own language. It's about being able to listen, being able to translate even through some of the visual tools that we already have, but equally trying to work out ways in which you can start surfacing a lot of this and not just meet in the middle, I would say, because I think we are still talking about justice, and justice is a much more radical concept than, I guess, trying to make gradual improvements in many ways, and many people might not be ready for those changes, and those changes can be quite hard. Shifting power is really hard because it means somebody is also losing power. So it's important to have that sort of empathy for also the people that we work with in many ways, and for yourself, because a lot of this is quite hard work and it takes many years. So understanding that language, being able to reframe relationships, trust, a lot of this is about people. I think it comes down to so many of those things, but design has wonderful skills that we can use for that.
As you were talking, it just reminded me of a wonderful friend of Camden and the Institute of Family Therapy, Dr. Taiwo Afwape, and she's got this beautiful line. She specialises in liberation psychology, and she's got this wonderful line which I use a lot, which is something along the lines of, you can't give someone else power, but you can stop taking their power away. And the job sometimes is to let someone's own power breathe. That's how she talks about it. And so in the design process for us, and I felt it in what you were talking about and what you were talking about actually, how do you as designers let someone else's power breathe in the methods that you're using? And even just being kind of conscious to that. I mean, that was transformational for me when I heard Taiwo say that. And it kind of acknowledges that sort of liberation praxis, that nothing is decontextualized, abstract and neutral. You know, adopting a non-neutral stance is not a bad thing, particularly when we're thinking about power asymmetry. So yeah, I love that idea of power breathing and you being an agent of that breath.
Great. I have a lot more questions, but I think we need to open up to the audience now. Are there any questions from the audience? One down there?
Hi, amazing presentations, everyone. A couple of things that struck to me was probably like how you guys, everyone talked about creating equitable services. Another thing that struck from Hannah's presentation was that all services have the potential to cause harm to users. So I was just thinking, in our pursuit to design equitable services, are we creating dependency among users, and how do we strike a balance between creating equitable services and like providing support, and obviously like creating self-reliance in communities?
I was thinking of a project that I didn't talk about, but was around a program to train lay carers, so kind of family members, to administer end-of-life medications in the home. So basically, if someone is dying at home, family carers will do a lot ordinarily, but currently you're really not allowed to administer morphine or other kind of analgesics or kind of medications. And when I discovered this, it was just, to me, it was a patent injustice, the idea that family members were expected to do a lot, and when it came to the real critical moments in a person's end of life, that they weren't empowered and enabled to do that. And the interesting challenge was like, how do we make it's very easy to train, it's done in other countries, there's lots of evidence base that it's safe and actually it's very reliable. It's also legal in the UK, but how do we make it equitable, and how do we not cause further harm? Because one of the biggest challenges that when it comes to that is there's the kind of phenomenon, or the issue of the last injection, which is this idea that there comes a point in someone's end of life experience where they might get an injection of morphine and they'll die shortly after that. It's not usually what causes the death, but it can usually be, people think that that's what did it. And that is something that nurses as professionals struggle with, because they carry that burden of, did I cause that person to die? And so the idea of giving that burden to a family member, an additional burden of like, did I do that, is one of the challenges of that kind of experience of empowering people to take the ultimate responsibility and kind of ultimate care for their loved one, but with the caveat that you might put them in a position that might actually cause a lot of significant harm. And what always came back to us was, it's kind of cheesy, but it's underpinned by love, which transcends that, and also the idea that there are no easy ways out when it comes to end of life. It is just difficult, and that's really interesting when it comes to things like risk assessment. Is that yes, it will harm, because losing a loved one is a harming experience. Like you cannot kind of eradicate the pain, the grief, the loss. It's a naturally painful thing. So to not avoid it, or to try and avoid it, is actually is actually weirder, and that's kind of where we're actually in kind of European societies, that we've just tried to hide it and bury it away and kind of pretend it doesn't happen. It's not harmful. It is inherently harmful, but it's also natural. It's a part of life. So it's like these tensions are always there, and I think it's about the tensions and navigating and holding the tensions rather than trying to kind of design out the idea that you can harm things. It's about acknowledging where there is a potential for harm and seeing if people are willing to knowingly, consciously accept that potential for harm.
Just to build on that, I've got a couple of thoughts from the way we do things at Chen as well. I think we have quite a useful mindset going into the design of services that are supposed to support people who've experienced trauma, because we know that one of the things that happens when you're healing from trauma is that you're triggered. And as people are moving through some of our supportive resources, we know that that's going to happen for some of our users, and that's not a nice thing, right? We don't want to harm people, we don't want to trigger people, but we know that it's part of the process. So we provide additional resources to support people as they might be feeling triggered, so grounding exercises and activities that they can do, because we just get it. We know that that's the reality of what they're going through. And then another thing that was part of your question that made me think is that we're designing technology and digital services that don't create dependency. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot, because I work within Chen 2.5 days a week, and I also consult for lots of other organisations in the rest of my time, including like tech startups and much more commercial businesses. And a lot of digital service providers measure success through like dependency, through monthly active users and how many people are coming every day. And we do not do that. And I think that's a really interesting like model that's with the way we measure success is about the impact that we have for users. So we ask them questions about like, you know, did you feel validated? Did you learn about, you know, the abuse or trauma that happened to you? Did you take steps to support yourself? Did you share resources further within your own community? Do you imagine yourself with like a more hopeful vision of the future? And they may not come back to us for 6 months or a year after first using our services, and we don't think that's failure. But that was a really interesting thing for me to get my head around as a theory of change, and as a model of like success in digital product design. Yeah.
Should we take another question? Is there any other questions? Yep. And then we have one over there.
Thank you. So much amazing, inspiring stuff from all of you. Thank you. So I work in the NHS in a role focused on digital inclusion, and I feel like lots of the time in my work, you're just there kind of peeling back the layers, uncovering more and more issues and ways in which the broader system is broken and not serving people. And I think you've touched on some of it already, but something, I've forgotten your name, Becca, sorry. Something you said was about pivoting towards what needs to change in your process. So being kind of aware and shifting your approach when something else comes up. And I feel like I find myself sometimes just spinning round and round in circles because there's so many things that we could pivot towards that aren't working. So I guess I'm just interested in your reflections on how you kind of find peace with that and kind of fix your focus enough to make some progress somewhere whilst recognizing some of the broader inequities and injustices that you can't address through service design. Yeah.
There is no peace. No, I'm kidding. It's such a great question, you know, that, and particularly in public services, where public services are at the moment, particularly, it's, you know, you've got to name it as very sticky. You know, there's lots of stickiness in the system. I suppose just reflecting back on this project, what we came out with at the end was not what I thought we would. So I went into it thinking that we would get a kind of architectural design. Like, I need to structure services in this way to do this thing for these people in this way. That was what I had in my head. And we didn't land there. And that felt odd for a while because that was the brief I'd set myself. But where the parents and the students took us was a completely different journey, which was what emerged quite naturally was this is how good help for families should feel. So there was the emotional content of it. And that wasn't directed, that was just allowed to kind of emerge in the way that the workshops were kind of opened up and run, and the storytelling, story sharing element of it as well. I don't know if this is this mic on?
It's on.
Okay, great. So that emerged kind of quite organically, and rather than just squash it and say, no, what I need is an architectural design, just let it breathe, let it be what it is. So they focused on this, how good help for families should feel, and then they came up with this is how it should be, and we'd storyboarded at that point, and they'd done their who, what, when, where, why kind of stuff. But it was a kind of broad vision. Now, the challenge then is how do you take that broad vision and create the architecture? And that was the job that was laid down to us. You know, we had some prototypes that could support that. But there was something about me making my piece that this thing that I thought we would get wasn't where we ended up. And the thing that we ended up with was of probably way more value and needed to come first before the big solution that I thought we would get. Which isn't to say that it's not incredibly hard, because it is, right? To name that.
I can also add. Yeah, I feel like I also
feel your pain, and I probably don't have answers. I think there's a few things. So I think one of the things I'm trying to teach myself to do or think about is like sometimes things emerge, but it might not be the right time for you to take them forward or engage. So sometimes like there's some things that you might be aware of, or things are aware going on in different places, and you can't fix them all. But sometimes if you think about what you would do, then sometimes the opportunity presents itself a bit later. So I think like being aware of what's going on, and then thinking about the things you can influence now is quite helpful. And then waiting for the opportunity to jump. And then I think the other thing is sometimes doing things that seem quite boring or not part of your job can be a way in to doing the other things. So like I don't know, this is just a made up example, but say like there's something that's not working, and then you're like, oh, hey, I can run a workshop for you on that. And you're like, why do I want to be running this workshop for someone? That's their job. But actually through doing that, you then kind of build that relationship, and then you might be able to weave things that you want into that workshop and make it happen on the sly. So yeah, it doesn't really solve the problems, but I think it's about how you cope with the problems.
We have another question.
Hello. Thank you, all of you, for your presentation. Super inspiring, and would love to catch up on the slides if we have a chance later. My question is, how do we get buy-in from clients and stakeholders to take a social justice approach in projects where time and budget are always limited? There's always pressure to take the cheapest and fastest approach. And how do we translate into benefits that they can understand and value as a better approach?
I can start us off. I think it's an interesting question because I've sort of like mostly worked as a consultant in my career, and I sort of usually am in those situations of trying to convince people and making, space for design, different places. I think in many ways, there are very few instances where I would say people do not want to do that good. People want to do it, but there will always be some other pressure or some other senior stakeholder, something coming from somewhere else that is getting them to, I guess, not deliver the thing that is right. And I think that there's almost like multiple pronged approaches around this in many ways. I think one is sort of like trying to really understand where that pressure is coming from, what's really driving the time and budget conversations, and how can you sort of start influencing that in some ways even. Another one is sort of like trying to start to build some evidence and foundation around the risks of just going ahead even. Because sometimes you might not be able to deliver the social justice piece in the 2 months that you might have or 3 months that you might have. But what you can do is you can create a foundation to either transfer capability or build evidence in different ways where others can also carry on that work in many ways. So for me, a lot of the success in this work, because it is so long and is so arduous and takes so long, is about understanding how and when to plant those seeds in many ways, and to start understanding what would be that, I guess, the nurturing conditions so that you can flourish those ideas moving on. So I don't need to be the only designer holding all of this and solving all of this. What I need to have is a group of people who are on the same page with me, whether it's clients, whether it's team members, whether it's different people, and that we can actually take that work forward, because social justice is not my fight alone. It's a mission that we all need to be on together in many ways. I know this is sounding really abstract, but I genuinely do believe in it. So it is about how can I influence people, how can I bring people on that journey? And it might not be in one meeting, it might be multiple meetings, it might be multiple ways in which I tell that story to different people all around me, or build different types of evidence even.
I mean, can I just pick up on that? I mean, one thing that surprises me is in a way that you always leave traces behind, and some of it, the way that I work around incorporating sort of, well, social justice within my work, there are so many, within the team, so many experts, they have such a view in terms of ways of working, what's evidence, and how they are quite driven towards particular targets and deliverables. But actually, over time, I can see that what's left behind, even in teams now, which I've left and projects are finished, that the language changes, and the way that people think about the problem. And I think sometimes one of the things we're not so good at is looking at what these traces are. And I know from work that we did with Camden years ago, and Delina, who worked with me on the DOSA project, now works at Camden. The Home Library project, it's those, you may not be using what I'd call very explicit ways of working around social justice, but just actually that learning by doing together is actually having an influence, and things get left behind. And I had a conversation with somebody not so long ago who was from a veterinary college, and they said, oh, I heard one of your team members talking from the DOSA team. They said, gosh, the whole language is so different about inclusion and how we should work. And it's also it's a very drip process, I think. You know, you have what I'd call formal ways of working. And then there's just other things where you're saying, please read this, or can you think differently? So for me, I think there are time pressures, but also there's a lot more implicit stuff that goes on through the ways of working that gets left behind, which often we can miss as well.
I totally agree. I think like this idea of what's coming down the pipe, and what the fact that some of these ideas were quite radical within the workplace not so long ago. I think something really simple is just to tell people that it's the future. It's happening. Like, you can either get on board or you can get left behind. Like, that's the kind of thing that lots of leaders respond well to. You can be generous with the types of personalities that they might be, and think about, you know, being part of the solution, you know, creating a narrative of, are we healing or are we harming here? And getting buy-in that way. Or you can go more hardcore and just be like, I don't want to work for an organisation that's causing harm. And, you know, your students, you can make like major choices about where you go on to apply your skills and talents. So I think there's definitely something to be said as well for like not exhausting yourself working for organisations that don't care at all, because there's plenty of really amazing organisations that need smart people who do. But yeah, creating a narrative and helping people understand how important this stuff is and that it's already happening is really important, I think.
Yeah, can I add to that? I think also with time, like I think often when it comes down to it, you will be, well, people think they don't have time for stuff, but also as a designer, I think it's important to know what you can do with more time and less time, and be able to have like, this is the quick version of the thing I would do, or this is the longer version of the thing I would do, and be a bit pragmatic about that, because I think often, like I would love to do so many things in my work that I can't do because we don't have enough time, and there's not really, like pushing back on that doesn't work. So then actually it's like, well, what can I do in a small amount of time, and explain that to people, and then kind of be confident in your like quick version of the thing as well, I think is really important.
I think it's also, I mean, this is why this issue and this topic is complex, but I also think it's important to resist the urge to always crunch things into smaller, cheaper things, because this work is not simple and cheap and easy. And so I definitely think like finding ways, like with trauma-informed research, there's loads of ways in which if you do things in a more trauma-informed way, it's actually better for everyone, it is cheaper. Like, let's design a task that you can do in your own time instead of doing a qualitative interview. You can do 5 times more of those than you can do interviews, and it's more trauma-informed. So there's definitely cost-saving and time-saving things. But if you're working for people who are like obsessed with just doing everything cheaper, then they may not have the right mentality to do this kind of work.
Great. I think that might be a good note to end on, because it is time. I just wanted to announce something. I'll have to swap microphones. Yes. So our last event in this series for this year is Pluriversal Ways of Knowing. I was hoping that Male would be here, but she's very ill today, so she can't come and tell you a little bit about this event. But it will be happening at some time in June, date and location to be confirmed, so keep an eye on the newsletter here. Thank you so much to all of our amazing speakers. It's been so enriching to hear all of the talks and the discussion afterwards. And so please join me in a round of applause for everyone.